Welcome, everybody. My name is Tommy Soares. I'm the Assistant Director of the Purdue Institute of Inflammation, Immunology and Infectious Disease. And today it is my pleasure of welcoming Emily Atkinson, who is a venture analyst for life sciences and biotechnology at IU Ventures, or is it Indiana University Ventures? Is it IU Ventures?
Yeah, we always say IU Ventures.
IU Ventures. Awesome. Well, it is awesome to have you on the show, Emily. I've been looking forward to having this interview with you. Thank you so much for volunteering your time to talk to us today. And thank you for being our Pathfinder today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm always happy to talk with graduate students and postdocs about career opportunities.
Fantastic. Well, that's essentially our audience here, or at least that's who we think, and it can be anybody, really, anybody that's interested in a career that's at least starts off as a scientist, and it could end off as a scientist, but doing many different things. And so that's why I was so interested in having the opportunity of talking to you, because this is the first time on the show that we've had this opportunity to see somebody who is now as a venture analyst. We've seen somebody who's gone in this trajectory, became a patent agent, became a lawyer, and her name is Jessamine Pilcher, and she started off in science, and it was a matter of different accomplishments and different things that happened to her in her life that gave her inspiration to go this route. So, this is why we wanted to talk to you, is to understand, maybe what was your background like? What was your training like, and what has led you down this path to now become a venture analyst? And afterwards, you're gonna have to tell us what it all means, because most of us don't really know what you do. So we'll get into that. But why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your background, and we can go from there.
Yeah. So I grew up in Indianapolis, so still local. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. So I, grew up with a very humble family. I grew up on the southwest side of Indianapolis, and something that my dad always kind of instilled in us, there were so many of us kids, we couldn't necessarily afford to go on vacations, or I also grew up pre-internet, I was on the cusp. I'm a millennial, so I do remember a little bit of what life was like before that. I didn't have a cell phone until I was in high school. So I spent a lot of days outside with all of my siblings, and with 4 siblings, we were all super competitive, always trying to fight each other, be the best at something. And so I was like, okay, how do I distinguish myself from the other 4 kids in this house? So my dad was always very kind of analytical, and if something would break in the house, he would be like, okay, let's take it apart and put it back together and figure out what's wrong with it. And so naturally, we all kind of just started taking everything apart and learning how things worked. More of kind of, I guess, from an engineering perspective, taking apart a lawnmower and putting it back together, things like that. But the one thing that no one in my family knew was why the body works the way it does. So, just from walking, day-to-day stuff, or running, we would get injured, break a bone. I've broken 13 bones, which I thought was normal until I get those reactions. And so I kind of became more interested in how biology was also playing a part, and how do we figure out why things go wrong? And that was something that my dad couldn't teach me. And I think that was kind of the rebellion in me. I wasn't going to go out and do other crazy things, but I was going to go learn something that nobody else knew, just from, again, competing with my siblings standpoint. And so and again, I got hurt like all the time. And so originally I was thinking about school. In high school, I was like a student athletic trainer. And so I learned a little bit about athletic training. And I originally wanted to be a physical therapist. So how can we take injuries and then rehab them? So in undergrad, I went to IUPUI. Again, I was the youngest of 5 kids. And by the time they got to me, they were like, hey, we're out of money. You got to pay for your own school. So I said, okay, I'll live at home. I'll go to IUPUI. I'll be in the city. Like I'll land an internship somewhere. There are multiple hospitals. I thought that was a good idea. And so I majored in health and rehabilitation science. And again, with the idea of going into physical therapy. And then once I started getting into the physical therapy workshops, instead of treating injuries, I was much more interested in why the injuries were occurring or why diseases were occurring. That was just much more intriguing to me. And this kind of happened between my sophomore and junior year of undergrad. And so I went to my academic advisor and I was like, hey, I don't really want to do this anymore. I don't want to be a physical therapist, but I also don't want to switch majors. It was important to get out in 4 years. And so what can I do? Or, I'm kind of interested in learning more about biology, but I don't want to switch my major to biology. And so he said, why don't you try research out? And again, I come from very humble beginnings. Like I didn't know what a scientist was probably until college and just my professors and things like that. I never put it together that the people at a university studying in their labs are called scientists. And so I got set up with a research internship through the LHSI program at IUPUI, and I got placed in a lab at the IU School of Medicine. Dr. Lillian Plotkin was my mentor, and she's probably the number one person in my life that's helped my career trajectory. So she studied osteoporosis and different biologies behind that, different drug treatments for that, et cetera. And so that's kind of how I got interested in research. I really liked it. It was something that's different every day. The questions are endless. The potential is, you can always keep going. You'll never be bored of it. And then I decided I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't want to pay to do a master's. This is kind of all coming down to money in my life, which is fair. I think that's a fair perspective. I didn't want to pay $40,000 for 2 years when I knew I wanted a PhD. And so I decided to apply to PhD programs. Again, my major was still health and rehabilitation science. I didn't take many biology classes. I never took organic chemistry. I never took genetics. I never took biochem, but I was super good in the lab. Like the lab research came very naturally to me, and figuring things out, because it's, again, okay, we have a problem. Let's kind of take it apart and put it back together, or let's stop one thing and try it this way, and problem solving. And I got into the PhD program at IU School of Medicine, the same IBMG program. It's like a gateway program. I think Jessica Pellman was in the same program. So I did that, and then I studied a few different disease areas, all kind of around bone, the musculoskeletal system, but drug treatments for osteoporosis. I studied multiple myeloma for a while. And then at the end of my PhD, I started to get a little bit into diabetes as well. And during my PhD, I became really interested in scientific communication and scientific outreach. Again, going back to my roots, I very much come from a blue collar world. And so anytime I would go home, I have to explain to my parents in lay language of what I was doing. And I think that's important, especially society needs to understand the diseases that they're being affected by. And so I really liked helping flip that switch for people of connecting what I'm doing to a disease that maybe is affecting them or a family member, et cetera. So I did a lot of scientific writing, scientific outreach, and a little even science policy work. I also became a huge advocate for graduate students and grad student rights during my PhD. And so those were all kind of really important to me during that process. And then towards the end of my PhD, which I recently graduated this summer, I discovered something like really cool, but over my time in research, I felt like, it's kind of coming to an end. Like my PhD is ending. I'm having like a quarter life crisis. Have I done enough? Did I really figure this question out? And I wasn't very comfortable with how much work it took, 6 years. And I feel like I only made a little blip of progress into the research world. And so that was kind of unsettling to me. During my whole PhD process, again, I was super involved with scientific communication. I really thought I was going to be a scientific writer for a long time. During that process, I also became very interested in patent law, and, IP. And then I also became interested in just the regulatory pathway of drug discovery and more of a pharma industry. And I was applying for a lot of scientific writing jobs at big pharma companies, and I wasn't getting anything. I got a few interviews, but nothing was really sticking. And I had like a little bit of like self-doubt. Like I felt like it was wrong. I was like, there's a reason like this isn't working out, or like, am I even passionate about this anymore? Like, how can I use my skill set? And I also wanted to learn something new. And so I was having like a quarter life crisis. And so I was like, my next step in life, I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to do what's expected of me necessarily. How can I take all these things I'm interested in and also learn a new skill without going back to school? Because I was also done with school. And so one of my colleagues actually, like in grad school, another PhD student was like, hey, I think you would actually be really good in venture capital. You're a people person, you've done drug discovery work, etc. I think you should apply for this job being IU Ventures. And it was really the first time I had heard of scientists in VC, but IU Ventures was specifically looking for a life science person that could learn business. And so now in the venture world, a lot of people went out and got MBAs, but it's much easier to take a PhD and teach them business than put an MBA and teach them organic chemistry. And so we're kind of seeing a little bit of a wave in the VC world of more scientists joining. So I kind of took a blind leap of faith at a crossroads in my life, and I think it worked out.
Great. That's awesome. And it's so good to hear the positive aspects, obviously, and your attitude, your positive attitude. You mentioned so many good tidbits in there, though,
yeah.
And I'm hoping we can go back and unpack some of those if you can. You mentioned a few of the mentors. Take us back. Take us back to those moments when, first of all, you might have realized, oh, this is a mentor and this is a person that is making a significant change in my life. What was that like with Dr. Plotkin or other mentors? And what is it that they told you or that you started to do with them that you realized this is really somebody I need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so funnily enough, for the LHSI internship program, I interviewed with two other PIs, who I'll just say their names, Dr. Organ and Dr. Allen, and at the IU School of Medicine, and they studied musculoskeletal disorders as well. But I wasn't a perfect fit for them. They had other students, but I interviewed so well that they introduced me to Dr. Plotkin, who wasn't even in the program yet. So I think the power of an interview, which I'll keep coming back to that because that's crucial to my story, is really important. I was super eager to learn. And again, I just needed experience. You just need one foot in the door sometimes. So I met with Dr. Plotkin and we just hit it off right away. She, again, is a huge mentor in my life, and she was even on my PhD thesis committee. And so she essentially joined this program just so she could mentor me, which is very nice. And that was kind of the first time I had an adult step into my life and help me for the betterment of me, not necessarily her, which I think was a huge learning lesson, especially as I get older now, of, giving back. And so I was in the lab, and again, I had no experience. I didn't have much biology background or scientific background class-wise, but, she would say, okay, here's this protocol, see if you can do it, think about things like along the way, and let's see what you come up with. So she was always very adamant of, you're kind of figuring this out on your own, try to problem solve. And then when you're stuck, you can come to me or another member in the lab and we'll figure it out together. So that's what, I guess, like positive reinforcement. And, joining a research lab for the first time is very scary. You're spending a ton of money a day. You're failing every day. You're failing weekly. You're failing monthly. You're like, hey, this is kind of adding up. Is this me? Is this the biology? And so to have someone say, this result is interesting, maybe it's not what we expected, but it is what it is. And so let's figure out why that happened. And so I think that was a huge lesson to learn early on in my research journey, as well as biology is biology. You're not always going to know the answer. Your hypothesis is usually wrong. And so let's just take the time to figure this out. And for her to actually take the time and figure it out with me, that was huge. And again, once I realized I really liked research, I told her, I really want to go to grad school. So I need to get those publications. I want to go to conferences, etc. And she gave me access to all of that, which I was very lucky and thankful for.
Sure. That's awesome. Do you remember some of the pieces of advice that she would give you, and anything that you can relate now? Because I got to tell you, Emily, it's impressive. It's impressive what you've done and the way that you reflect on yourself. Not too many people do it, and maybe not as many people do it as critically as you do it, but I sense that you're pretty tough on yourself. You don't let yourself down,
Yeah, I think, we grow up and we're told, okay, you have to be strong, you have to have thick skin, etc. And then, I think the internal journey of wanting to be the best you can be, and not just even for the ego, but for the science, it's I want to make sure that there is no human error in this application. So I can go to my boss and say, I trust this result 100% because I know what I'm doing is correct. And that's huge in science, as I'm sure you have to be able to trust the people you're working with in your lab to make sure that that data is actually correct. This was a few years ago now, so I'm trying to remember any pieces of advice, but I think the number one thing that not only Dr. Plotkin, but just I've learned in the research labs in general, is to not take things personally. So again, coming in with tough skin, and I was very hard on myself, but there does come a point where you also have to learn. You kind of have to remove yourself from the project. And say you're working on a failing project, which is 95% of the time. There are many internal battles, especially during the PhD, is this me? Am I stupid? Am I dumb? Why can I not figure this out? And I spent a lot of my early career with that mentality. And I think that goes back to, I didn't major in biology. I wasn't the first pick for that internship. Even in grad school, I got waitlisted first. And again, my interview was so well, they decided to take me. So I think that can have a huge mental impact on somebody. But once I finally learned that this is the project and I'm just assigned to this project, I have the power to figure it out, or I have the power to crumble. And so I think once I learned that lesson, it was much more of a 2D process. Again, this is the project you're assigned, let's figure it out, not having the personal connection to it. It's like, if the project's failing, it's the project. It's not you failing as a scientist. And once I kind of jumped over that hurdle, science was fun and subjective, like, honestly.
Yeah, I really like that attitude. But do you think, you as we're talking and you're describing, you keep going to this fact, which is a fact, that most of the stuff that we do in the lab, especially as we're starting to learn how to do things in the lab, most of it doesn't really work very well.
Mm-hmm.
And you're learning the process of science as you're learning science, right? But you alluded to this fact that, it is a lot about failures. Tell us a little bit about this. I mean, it seems like you've learned a lot from your failures per se. But as you reflect now on some of the successes that you've had too, what's the balance between learning from a failure and learning from an actual success?
Yeah, so I think a lot of like mentality comes into it. Again, learning a technique for the first time, you're not going to be perfect. But my PhD advisor, he would say, walk through this like in your head, or do a mock run of this if you need to. So by the time you are wasting all that money, or like, you're not throwing away all of the reagents. So you can walk through it and like understand it completely. What's the question you're asking? What's the process you're going through? What results are you expecting? And so I think that to think about those things before you get your hands on something, I think is critical in learning how to problem solve. So if I came in with a direct question I'm asking, I know the protocol in and out, I would always have a protocol also like on hand. I feel like sometimes when you're at the end of your PhD or the end of your postdoc or whatever, you're like, oh, I can do this in my sleep. But I would always have it just in case and read it. And I would also take notes in my own language, like my own thoughts, like dialogue. I would write dialogue out. And so say, for example, like on step 3, you're going to forget you need to turn on the centrifuge. And so I'd say, Emily, turn on the centrifuge. It needs to be set to these things. Or, sometimes you have to refrigerate a small centrifuge. Put that in there now, because you'll forget. And then once you start forgetting things, you panic, and then you have to like speed up things just to save the experiment. And then say you do that, say something as simple as the centrifuge had to be at 4 degrees and you left it on the table and you put it in there 2 minutes before and you think it's going to be at 4 degrees now. And then your experiment fails. Okay, so did the experiment fail because the centrifuge wasn't at 4 degrees or the biology? So I think taking the time beforehand to go through the motions is very important. And then you can critically analyze the results with maybe it is a failure. Okay, why did it fail? Again, is it the experiment? Did I do an error? And I think like anytime I admit that I messed up to my mentor, they're like, okay, that's fine, because they can trust me. I'm admitting my own failure. Maybe they'll ask you why you missed that step. Maybe they won't. But, maybe you're having a bad day or something, and you can say, I wasn't in the right headspace to do this experiment today. Or maybe you forgot a simple step that you've done correctly 100 times over, and then today you missed it. So I think admitting when you're wrong is important. And then again, going back to knowing what the expected result is. And so if you do get that result, well, that's your hypothesis. And then if you don't, again, repeating it, maybe that happens 3 times. And so now you have a different pathway to go down because you're just changing your hypothesis. So.
Yeah. And I like how you said it before. Don't take it personally.
No.
It's just science. It's just a puzzle to solve.
Right.
Right? Yeah. And I really like your attitude also of, you know, being prepared, but also this piece of like, oh, I missed a step. I have to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that you learned? Something that was that an experience that you went through, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't lie. I should say what really happened. Or have you always been like this because you're one of 5 kids and you knew that telling the truth was the best way to reach mom and dad?
You know, you can either tell the truth or just get really good at lying. No, I'm kidding. You know, my first 3 years of my PhD were really difficult for me. You know, I was doing a study that just was not panning out. And, you know, I've had good mentors, I've had bad mentors. And that study was just not working. And I was doing the same thing every week. You know, I repeated the study 3 times. It was like a big in vivo study. And you get to the point where it's like the study fails so much. Again, like you do start to question if it's you or if it's the study. And I think it's also, you know, your PI is been working on this for years. So you trust their opinion. You trust that this is going to like work out. And then sometimes it's really not the case. And that's kind of what was happening my first 3 years of my PhD. You know, I was failing regularly with no positive success rate. And so I think we learn about this in class too, like the ethics of science. It's like, okay, if you're going to your boss weekly and saying, yeah, it didn't work. Sorry, wasted 10K. Yeah, it didn't work. Sorry, wasted 10K. Yeah, it didn't work. Sorry, wasted 10K. And you get a bad response, you know, that does start to affect you. And I mean, scientists talk about it all the time. Again, you have to take an ethics class of, you know, if you're hearing that for 3 years, you know, some students would start falsifying data, which is a crime, you know? And so I think keeping that integrity is like extremely important, especially when you are failing. And, you know, there was a time for me where I was like, this is just the project. Like we have got to pivot. And that was a hard conversation to have. And so there's that aspect of it. And, you know, you wanting to keep the integrity that you've been raised on, that you've instilled in yourself. But then grad school is hard, you know, and burnout is real. Again, if you're repeating the same experiment for 3 years, I think some PIs hold on to things too long. That can start affecting you. And so, you know, learning that process of like, yes, this is the biology, like this is not me. And again, if you can hold on to your integrity, knowing that you just have to pivot. And sometimes your bosses don't want to hear that, but you're like, I've done everything I can for this, and this is just not what you think it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And being honest that way, I mean, after trying things over and over and over again, there has to be some reconciliation, right? Or some
Right.
things with the professor to explain, right? And I think we've all been through that. If you've done a PhD, you've been through that, where
Mm-hmm.
there is always a set of experiments that don't work, no matter how many times you tried or what you tried or didn't try. How did you deal with the adversity, though? You mentioned you had good mentors and bad mentors. What I can't imagine that the bad mentor was like malicious, but I can imagine that they were not as helpful as a good mentor.
Right.
How did you deal with the situation of having a bad mentor, knowing that you're in this situation, I gotta just plow through it? Or did you just say, well, I'm going to hang it up, go do something else? How did that work?
Yeah. So honestly, that was probably like the most difficult time I have been through, like in my life. And it kind of reached a point where I did have the mentality, okay, I've got to push through this. I know I can figure this out. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just not a relationship that's working. And that's okay. Like, people all work differently. And so I ended up actually switching labs. And there were two head professors that kind of stepped in. I was not doing well. I started kind of not doing well in the classes. I didn't look great. I was very tired all the time. And then I also was going through some like health difficulties. So kind of everything came to a head at once. And I had tried everything I could to work out with that mentor, communicate better, but eventually it didn't work out. And I had to learn that sometimes the relationships don't work out and you have to move on. And again, that's like a lot of looking into yourself and, is it me? Am I the problem, etc. And sometimes it is you and sometimes it's not. And so I ended up switching labs in my third year. And I love that project. I joined that lab because I love that project. The PI was extremely prestigious, but it just wasn't going to work out for me. I didn't fit in there, and maybe I could have pushed through, but I wouldn't have been happy with it. So I decided to switch labs during the third year of my PhD, which was really scary. You're 3 years in. A PhD is so long that you're nowhere near the light at the end of the tunnel in year 3. And then, having to start over essentially is very hard to deal with sometimes. But I switched into another lab, again, still focusing on like musculoskeletal stuff, drug discovery. I knew all of the techniques, and it was just a better environment. And, I kind of thrived in that one. So I think perspective also matters, and kind of how you're willing to challenge yourself, but also knowing when it's time to say, hey, I can't do this anymore, is a good skill to learn. I learned a lot of things in my PhD.
Yeah. And I have to say, I went through a similar experience, and you do learn so much about yourself, about your own personality.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that you're mentioning that, because it does take a lot of sleepless nights of thinking, what am I doing? For me, it was after 2 years. For you, it was after 3 years.
Yeah.
But it's similar. I can imagine the consternation of like, am I just going to throw away 3 years of what I've done to go all over again? But at the end, you reflect back and you said, okay, you said you thrived in that new environment, and so did I. Do you think it was a new environment, or do you think you had learned certain lessons that allowed you now to be much more efficient and just hit the road running?
Yeah, I think it was definitely the latter. I had learned so much. Again, I was solid in the lab. Like, I had great hands. Like, I knew like what I was doing. And so knowing that I knew all of my fundamentals. And so now it's truly like the philosophy part of your PhD. I think that was like a huge point for me, because I was like, okay, I can do these experiments. Now it's truly figuring out, what does this mean? And then also having the perspective of, again, this is the project I'm assigned. I think my head was way more clear. And so I was a little bit more successful, just because, I was like, this is the project I'm assigned. I know what I'm doing. I have the confidence now. And now we're really figuring out what this means and where this is going. I think just a fresh perspective, a little bit of expertise, I guess. In year 3, I was starting to feel pretty comfortable with what I knew, what I didn't know, what I could still learn. And so kind of like, yeah, hitting the ground running. All my friends joke that my middle name is Efficient. So that's funny that you brought that up.
Well, I mean, again, like it's just the way you're speaking and the way that you're telling the story. It seems like you were able to just continue and pick up and be very efficient. Tell us about this though now with the communication and this inspiration to be a science communication writer or applying for those jobs, getting rejected for every single one of those jobs. And then like some kind of epiphany for venture analysts and doing the business side of things. So let's go back.
Yeah. So again, I loved communicating like what I was doing in the lab to a layperson and other scientists, anyone that needed to know, because I think that's really how you know what you're doing, is if you can communicate it to any type of person and them understand what you're doing. I really enjoyed writing, which I know a lot of the students don't like, but I loved that part. Writing up my results, this is what it means. This is like the potential it has. And then again, not only doing that for scientists, but lay people as well. I did a lot of scientific outreach with the Taste of Science organization, which is a nationally recognized organization that brings science to the public. And so they would bring scientists to like bars, essentially. Like there's a lot of like programming for kids, like learning about science, but there's not necessarily programming for adults or like voting citizens to learn about science. And so we would have little kind of seminars, but at a bar, and have a scientist come in and talk about like the story behind science fiction or the science behind tattooing, the science behind like werewolves, like things that are like more fun to the public, and then getting the scientist exposure to other like citizens, and then getting citizens exposure to a scientist, because if you survey people, a lot of them will say that they don't know a scientist. And so I think just getting exposure that way is really important. And that was very rewarding for me. We started, I started like a scientific outreach group at IU, and we did these things called anatomy nights, where we would go dissect an organ in a bar that didn't serve food. That's how we got away with it. And so that's fun. Like we would have anatomy education students come dissect like a cow's heart at a bar, and people could come learn about it. And then sometimes we would have stories, that we would tell about like hearts or whatever. And that was kind of what carried me through a lot of like the dark days of grad school, knowing that people find this cool, and it is cool. And so I really enjoyed writing scientific papers, grants, but also I wrote like a few blogs on just random science things. And so I love doing that. And so I really thought that that's what I was going to do as a career. And then again, coming to the end of the PhD, my PI had worked for years on something and finally got somewhere. We were at the stage where we were ready to like make a drug on what we discovered, and then he might retire, and then I'm gone, and nobody else in the world studied what we studied. And so like that was kind of the uniqueness of it. That could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. There's no competition, but maybe nobody else cares. So this essentially could die like with us. And so I think too, like, I got into science just curious on how the body worked the way it did, and wanting to find these drugs to cure diseases that are affecting our families. And then I kind of realized like that's not the fun part for me anymore. And so, and again, we brought this up in our discussions prior, but during grad school, you're always taught academia or industry. And whichever one you pick, you're going to sell your soul. Like that's how everyone frames it. So no matter what side you join, it's like nobody's going to be super happy and you're going to sell your soul. And so that's kind of all I knew. And I put all my eggs in that basket, and then I was just not getting the results. And I was like, man, what is going on? Again, is it me? Is it my resume? I can't get past HR. How can I not get past HR with my resume? or my CV. And then, you know, I'm married and I had to sit down with my husband, and, you know, supporting someone through grad school is hard enough. And then to come to him and like, hey, I think all of my hopes and dreams are not what I thought they were. You know, I'm kind of scared. Like, I don't know. I have to apply for like my first job. I have to get my first job, really. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to step the wrong direction. And I really don't know what's out there. And so one of my friends, again, from grad school, like he's still in the program, he just was like, you know, he had done a business minor and a couple internships in venture capital. And he was really like, you have the personality for this. And they need scientists to come learn about or teach more of the business world of why science is important, et cetera. And so I was like, you know what? That sounds interesting. And so essentially what the job description was for IU Ventures was, you know, you can help scientists take their ideas from lab and make them into a business. And so I get the innovation that comes from academia and then helping them form businesses like an industry. And so that was really like the fun part for me, because how do I keep my science background and use it? How do I get the innovation from academia that I've always loved? You know, it had a little bit of patent law in there that I was kind of interested at one time. I thought about going to law school. It had the drug discovery and like regulatory processes that you would see from the pharma industries. And I got to learn a new skill, and I got to meet with people all the time. And, you know, that was something I struggled with too. At the end of my PhD, like, you're just in lab and you're not talking to anybody. You're just doing experiments and writing. And I missed interacting with people and like going to conferences. And part of that was due to COVID, of course, but I missed that. And then David, my friend, he recommended me for this position, and I met with IU Ventures, and the team was like super great. And it was funny, the interviews for all the writing jobs were like, well, tell me everything you know about science. And then this job was like, well, how good are you with people? Can you speak to people? Oh, you have a PhD? Great. We'll check that box. So she knows science. But how are you good with people? Like, and so it was a very different perspective. And it was also funny because, you know, I couldn't lie about my resume. I didn't have any experience. I was just interested in it. I am good with people. I know the science. I'm capable of learning. I have a PhD, so I can learn new things. And it was kind of like a bet on me. And again, that all comes back to the interview process as well. My interviews have literally carried me through every step of my life.
So give us a little bit of an just brief. What is it that we should be doing to prepare ourselves for these interviews, to be effective during the interview? How do you show confidence, but also still humility and
Right.
you know, approaching the science with its level of respect that it deserves?
That's a good question. So again, all the interviews I did were very different from each other. And I think you'll learn that you have to tailor your CV or resume to every different type of position like you're applying for. But once you get the interview, it really is a lot about personality and how you can go back and forth with someone. You know, if you need to communicate science or really anything, can you communicate well? Can you communicate it like to the point? You know, nobody wants to hear a 15-minute story on what protein you're studying. What's the point of this? Like, can you get to the point quickly? And I think honestly, with the confidence, in grad school, I feel like there's always something you won't know. And if you don't surround yourself with the appropriate mentors, they're going to let you know that you don't know everything every day. And that was something I struggled with a lot. And, you know, ironically, with my defense, I was going back and forth with my PI like 3 weeks before on my defense, like my PhD, like the ending of what my statistics meant. And I thought it meant one thing. He thought it meant another thing. And literally the day before my defense, he finally agreed that I was correct. And I was like, you know what? Why did I not put my foot down sooner? I knew I was right. I was analyzing a two-way ANOVA. It was a very, statistics can be very simple and straightforward sometimes. And again, that's not over-interpreting your data. I was like, this is what it means. I'm not further interpreting it. I don't know. That's a future experiment. And I think having that argument, honestly, right before my defense, I was like, no, I know what I'm doing. I know more than you now. And nobody knows more about this than I do. And I had to have like a conversation with myself. And, my defense was probably the best presentation I had ever given in grad school. And so I think that really helped with my interviews as well. I know what I'm doing. I know how to speak about it. And then even for this interview, again, it really all came down to the soft skills that you forget you have in grad school. So being able to speak publicly in front of people, that's a huge skill everyone hates doing. I had to do it. So I just so happened to be good at it. Knowing how to read a paper and picking up the 3 things you need to know about it. And then even from the business side now, it's like, if a scientist is working on a drug, is this just a drug that they can license or have a patent? Or can we make a whole business around this? Is it one cancer drug, or is there potential for 12 cancer drugs? And learning how to do that kind of quickly, honestly, is really a huge selling point for interviews or just any conversation you're having.
And Emily, do you give yourself a pep talk before going in, saying these things to yourself, creating confidence? Because, there's some guidance to say that it's your frame of mind, right? Before you go in, if you're all nervous and all shaky and anxious, it's very hard to think under that stress, right? When you got like adrenaline rushing through and your brain is all scattered all over the place. So do you give yourself a little bit of a pep talk before going in, before giving that talk, and say, no, you're okay, you know this, just be confident, be calm?
Yeah. I think so. And now that my PhD is over, it's like, okay, well, you earned your stripes. And so you have to, people are expecting you to have earned your stripes. So you better be confident about it. That's kind of the mentality I take now is, once you graduate, everyone's like, oh, do I have to call you doctor now? And I'm like, no, like, of course you don't. First of all, you're my dad. Like, why would you call me that? And then, but here I'm like, oh, no, you don't have to call me doctor. Like, unless I need the expertise or people need to know that I'm a scientist by training, but no, like, please call me Emily. But then sometimes when I'm at meetings with people, I'm like, no, like, I have a doctorate. I know what I'm talking about. So I think it's, and I think that's the thing of like wanting to be humble, of course, but then knowing like you have earned your stripes and you don't have to be obnoxious about it. But again, people are expecting you to use your expertise and use it well. So, they can trust you as well. I can't be unconfident anymore. And so it's kind of like a role you play. Sometimes I have moments of doubt, and it's hard meeting with people all the time now. Because again, in the science world, I was only meeting with scientists. And so depending on who you're meeting with is like, you could be a little bit more nervous or not. But then now it's like I'm meeting with business executives, I'm meeting with lawyers, I'm meeting with finance people. We all have a different background, and I'm supposed to be the resident science expert. So I better bring that person to the table.
That's great. I love that aspect, though. It sounds really exciting, meaning that, you have to be responsible and whatever science you do bring, or whatever expertise you do bring, is it about that, or is it more about, oh, we're willing to work this out and work together and learn, and so on, having that attitude that, I'm a scientist. And really what I love about you, Emily, is that you're so human about it.
Yeah.
admitting it and making sure that you give yourself that advantage, if you want, and giving yourself that space, because it's important to recognize that, but also recognize that you do play a role. You were hired
Right.
to play this role, right?
Mm-hmm.
No matter whether you like it or not. That's
Exactly.
a different thing.
Exactly. Yeah. You better. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And tell us a little bit, like, what's your day to day like? What do you do? And you say you're talking to different lawyers and different business people. Are you doing like business talk? Are you negotiating? Are you like, what's your role? What do you do?
Yeah. So the main thing that I do as a venture analyst is I essentially evaluate companies to see if they're worth investing money in. And so companies will come to me and, I'm the first contact person on our team. And again, I focus on our life science and biotech companies. And there's also a lot of like software and tech, other companies. We have another person who does that, but we sit on all of the intro calls together. And so essentially, people have an idea that they've wanted to create a business around. And so this is actually a good example. So Daniel Sheik, from Amplified Sciences, that's one of our portfolio companies. So just to put it into context. So Amplified Sciences will come to me and say, hey, I have this business. It's the CEO that's pitching the company. So the CEO will walk through a pitch deck. They're explaining the problem they've identified, what their solution is, who is their team. So they usually have the CEO is usually a business person. Then they have a chief scientific officer. They have maybe a tech person, financials person, et cetera. That not only with the problem and solution, there's like the market, which is more of the business side. So realizing, how big is this market? And so to put it into context, like cancer drugs. So, there's a real need for drugs for cancer to be solved. And so business people calculate what that number value is. So, they could come to me and say, we've realized this is an $88 billion market because so many people have these diseases. They're using all of these kits to diagnose. It costs this much money, it's costing so much money. And so if we get this, diagnostic ready and sell it, it has the potential because look at all this huge need there is. And so they'll come to me and I'll think, okay, that's really interesting. Or I'll say, hey, you're not ready yet. You're a little too early for us to actually invest into you. But if I think it's interesting, then I can invite them to actually pitch to our investment committee. And so what I'll do is I'll do a full research or due diligence on this company. I'll develop like a 10-page spreadsheet on everything about this company. Again, what's the problem solution? What's the team? What are their weaknesses in their team? Do they plan on hiring for those weaknesses? What's the market size? You have maybe one cancer drug. Again, is this just something they should license in a tech transfer office, or can we really build a whole company around this? Who do I know that could be potential investors in this as well? How can I help them? And then, what are the investment risks to this? Like, what do they do really well? What is pretty risky? So things like that. And so for me, the science part is the easy part. I can get that done very quickly, which is very refreshing. I finally, know enough to do something quickly. But then, I have to learn now the business side of it. So what are my weaknesses? Okay, I don't know this market size. So then I get to use different softwares or talk to different business people. Hey, can you validate this for me? You've worked at Roche for 20 years. Can you help me figure this out if it's worth like investing in? And we have some people on our team called executives in residence that are business people that have been in the science field for 20 years, et cetera. So I can go to them asking like for help because, I don't know as much about the business, but I'm figuring it out. And it's really fun to like learn a new skill and capitalize on the science as well.
And are they getting you to some courses? Are they doing like an executive MBA type of thing with you?
So again, I didn't need an MBA to do this job. And I asked them, I was like, hey, do you need me to do an MBA? And they're like, no. Again, it's way easier to take a scientist and just teach them business things. And so they did sign me up for the National Venture Capital Association courses. So that's like a class through UC Berkeley that it's like a crash course in venture capital. It's like a 10-week course I completed, and it's pretty much the standard, this is what you need to know. And that's like the basics, and then you'll figure it out as you go along, which is nice. Yeah.
Well, and it's good. It sounds like you also have some good colleagues that you can rely on, and people that you can ask and learn from. Any new mentors that you found in this, and any new tidbits of advice that they've given you to succeed in this new adventure that you're getting into?
Well, it's funny because, when I've heard the term venture capital in the past, I've been like kind of scared about it. And you're like, oh, those are investors. Like they're pretty greedy people and kind of aggressive, and they just want money, and, they're going to use you. But again, working for like a university and being involved in companies from a very early stage, everyone that works with those companies knows the risks in those, and they like want to help companies be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And so it's actually really refreshing. People are really nice. My whole team has like a different background. Like we have someone who majored in finance and like entrepreneurship. We have a science MBA person as well. We have people who have run businesses themselves, so they bring that experience to the table. And so that's also very fun, coming to a job where everyone comes from a different world and we can all collaborate together to achieve something. I get to work with lawyers when figuring out the deals, like the terms of like the deal. And so like that's really fun. And so everyone's actually super helpful so far that I've met like in this role. And I think that's a lot to do with the university system. We work with like Purdue as well, like very frequently. So that's fun too, because there's a little bit of like rivalry there. And we always favor companies that have their patents through IU, but we have companies like Amplified Sciences, their patents through Purdue. And so sometimes we make like these deals of like, okay, I'll fund this company if Purdue does this amount because it's filed through Purdue, stuff like that. And so it's nice to work with all the universities as well, and the venture teams along with those universities.
Great. That's really, really good. And it sounds like you have a panoramic view also of what's going on in the state of Indiana with these technologies. Anything that you want to say about that? How are we doing in the life sciences and biotech area? Anything that you want to tell us? Is this a vibrant point for our state? This is a vibrant area for our state.
Yeah, so the Midwest is, especially like Indiana, is kind of known for biotech. And so of course there's the big coast, Boston and Palo Alto, but it's very cheap to build a business here. It's very cheap to have your buildings here. And specifically like the city of Fishers is just completely killing the biotech game. They have so many startups that they've started. And then again, with the schools here and, retaining talent is a huge state initiative. I think too, that's a huge initiative of all the universities and the venture team. So it's like, well, if so many startup companies are coming here, then how can we use the students from our universities to populate those startups? So yeah, I think Indiana specifically is definitely growing. Indianapolis was ranked number 3 of the Midwest like venture deals, like growing up, like only behind like Chicago, and then I can't remember the second one. So we definitely have a presence, and that's also fun to learn the Midwest market as well. Like, of course, Chicago is number 1. But to know we're number 3, and then even Bloomington is like number 6, like West Lafayette's on there. So we're really establishing ourselves. And again, people like building businesses here. One, because of affordability, and 2, we are in between things, in between coasts. And so sometimes you can, be in the middle of everyone. And so it's much easier to travel here. Yeah. So it's definitely thriving and only going up from here.
That's the panoramic view I see too, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Emily Atkinson, venture analyst for IU Ventures. I think you should keep the doctorate. You've earned it for sure, especially when you have certain conversations with certain people. It's great. It's great to carry that badge, and definitely what a pleasure to talk to you and to learn from you through your journey of what we should do to succeed. And I want to thank you for just opening up and telling us a little bit about you and about your life, and congratulations on your success so far.
Thanks for having me. And if there are any follow-up questions on more of the venture world and the business world of science, like, you have my email, so the students can reach out.
Absolutely. And maybe they can reach out to you on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah.
Can they connect with you there?
Yes.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Dr. Atkinson,
Yeah.
and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.